Hi, everyone. Before we start today's podcast, I wanted to tell you about QCon London 2024. Our International Software Development Conference takes place in the heart of London this April 8th to the 10th. Uncover senior practitioners' points of view on emerging trends and best practices across topics like AI software architectures, generative AI, platform engineering, and modern software security. Explore what they've learned, techniques they've discovered, and the pitfalls to avoid to validate your ideas and plans. I'll be there hosting a track on connecting systems with speakers talking about APIs, protocols, and observability. Learn more at QConLondon.com. We hope to see you there. Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the InfoQ podcast. I'm Thomas Betts, and today I'm speaking with Fran Mendez about AsyncAPI. Fran is the founder and former project director for AsyncAPI and director of engineering at Postman. I previously spoke to him about AsyncAPI back in 2021. Version 3 has just come out, and I wanted to catch up and see what's changed. Fran, welcome back to the InfoQ podcast.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So to start off, for the listeners who might not be familiar with AsyncAPI or they haven't used it yet, I think it'd be useful to back up and say, what is AsyncAPI? What are the problems that it solves, and who is it for?
Sure. So AsyncAPI, I will say it's a format, it's a specification to define interactions in between services or applications that exchange messages, right? Like what I said is just like very generic because I always like to keep it generic because it is what it is. But you can think about it like the exchange of messages that you do through Kafka or WebSocket. And AsyncAPI helps you define this communication in between different applications, as I said, or services. So it helps you say what your application is sending and receiving, and what are the messages that are expected to come through, and how you can validate them. And also, like, it's not just a spec, it's a bunch of tooling that we provide.
Yeah, so the AsyncAPI, if I recall, it came from OpenAPI, and I think people are familiar with that. Swagger became OpenAPI, and it was, here's how I'm going to specify the contracts that my API agrees to. And so, like you said, the validation is very important of that. Like, here's the actual contract. And so this is similar, but it's meant for more the async processing, event-driven architectures.
Correct. So I tend to avoid using the word contract because of the many meanings of the contract testing and the contract word itself in tech. So yeah, I said definitions because you can use it for contract testing, you can use it for documenting or generating documentation, you can use it for validating on runtime to actually deploy infrastructure as code, and for a myriad of possibilities here, right? So yeah, and it's the same, if you want to think about it like this, it's the same as OpenAPI, formerly known as Swagger. And actually it started from the OpenAPI specification. That's how I started the spec, and it's meant for asynchronous interactions.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned documentation, because I think that's always one of the things, especially with async workflows, communicating what is being communicated and explaining to other people. And sometimes just having the ability to, in a consistent way, create that documentation is really, really useful. It just lowers the barrier to entry to using those services.
I agree, yeah. And it's actually our main use case so far. So it's also the low-hanging fruit of defining your interactions because, yeah, it's pretty easy and quick to generate documentation, right? It's the same for OpenAPI. Even though we're trying to escape from that messaging that says that AsyncAPI is about documentation, because we've seen that many people are missing the good parts of AsyncAPI, which is also code generation, runtime validation, infrastructure as code, and many other things that you could be doing, right? So documentation is going to be there, but we want to make clear that it's not just for documentation. It's not the documentation framework, right?
Yeah, those other tools are where some of the power really comes in. And I think people who've gotten invested in the OpenAPI ecosystem have learned, oh, I have this contract that my API publishes, and I just need to generate a client, and I can just go find that swagger.json or YAML file and run it through. And all of a sudden, I've got hundreds or thousands of lines of client code that I don't need to write and support, and they work. So version 3, what were some of the major goals with coming up with a new version? And is this a major version in the sense of there are some breaking changes?
Oh yeah, there are. We follow Semver, and as much as we can, of course, which is usually, we follow it. The problem is that with specification, it's always hard to understand what's going to be a breaking change and what's not going to be a breaking change. Some people argue that everything is a breaking change. So yeah, we try to, let's say, adapt to what the majority thinks, or what we think the majority thinks, is a breaking change here, right? So version 3, I'm glad you asked, because it's coming pretty soon, actually. By the time we are publishing this podcast, it will be already out. So yeah. So it comes with lots of goodies, but the major goal that we had, and the reason we started working on version 3, is because of the confusion that most people had with publish and subscribe. Let me explain a little bit what I mean. So in AsyncAPI, you have two verbs, publish and subscribe, unlike in OpenAPI that you have get, put, post, and all the HTTP verbs. In AsyncAPI, you have two, right? Thing is that it wasn't so much about publish and subscribe, meaning it's more about the perspective of the AsyncAPI definition. So the AsyncAPI definition, following the same approach as OpenAPI, is defining what others can do with your application. So if you see a subscribe, it means that you can subscribe to what my application is producing, right? And the same for publish, right? This works well for REST APIs and client-server interactions, but in messaging, most of the interactions are client to client, and the server is the broker. So that was that was highly confusing for people, saying like, what does it mean that my clients can use it or can publish to me? Like, I don't have clients. I don't even know who these clients are. I'm a client. I'm not a server, right? So yeah, that was highly confusing. So we changed that to send and receive instead. But it's not just a matter of changing the names. So we not only change the names, because the problem will still persist, right? But we change the perspective of what the document means. So when you have now an AsyncAPI document, this is not defining what others can do with your service or with your application. It's defining what your application is doing, right? So if you see a send or a receive, it means that your application is sending or is receiving. And if someone else is interested, then they will probably, and I say probably, will have to do the reverse operation. And I'm saying probably because in messaging, just because an application is publishing to, let's say, a Kafka broker, that doesn't mean that consumers can connect to Kafka directly, right? So we see this a lot of times. So I'm pushing something to a Kafka broker, but my customers are probably consuming this information from an HTTP API or a WebSocket connection on another URL, or maybe on another broker, because some messages are being forwarded, some others are not. So yeah, that doesn't mean that you have the permissions to subscribe to that same topic on Kafka, right? And the opposite is actually even, let's say, more frequent, which is it's common to see the pattern where consumers, if we want to call it like that, consumers publish messages to a broker using an HTTP endpoint, which has enhanced authorization mechanisms that the broker usually doesn't have, right? Or the underlying protocol like Kafka doesn't have, for instance. But then you can subscribe to them using the Kafka protocol, for instance. So yeah, I want to clarify that the perspective changed. So that's really important, because that means that it's no longer from the same perspective as OpenAPI or Swagger, if you want. And yeah, we thought about it for 2 years. We interviewed a bunch of people. We got a lot of use cases from different people. And this is the approach that seemed to make the most sense, right?
That makes sense that it started with OpenAPI. Like if you understand the origin story, that, oh, here's a specification that is kind of defining the definitions of what my service does. And that seemed like a good place for starting with async messaging. But as you got it more evolved over time, that model started to break down. I like the explanation that everyone understands how an API web server works, like HTTP requests. You send a request, you get a response. But the fact that what you are sending and receiving from AsyncAPI, you're not necessarily talking about that server being the thing you can connect to. And so what comes out one side is not what someone else can consume. Is there still value in saying that? Is that for other people to observe, or is it more for you to be able to put that in for documentation, to put it in for tooling and infrastructure needs? What's the benefit of having that more clearly defined in the structure now?
So now this new approach lets you do something that was impossible before. So now it lets you separately define where do you publish the messages and where do you have to subscribe to receive them, as I explained, right? So that's the example I was just explaining. But it also lets you do something that some people are, let's say, detractors of this approach, but we're seeing the same problem in OpenAPI. And it lets you define what the client, let's say, I hate to say client, let's say consumer, because everything is a client here, right? So what the consumer is able to do, right? So that means that before you had a single AsyncAPI file, and from that AsyncAPI file, you could generate the server or the client, right? The same that you do with the OpenAPI. And in some cases, you can still do server and client. So for instance, with WebSockets, you can have a WebSocket server. It's a proper server, it's not a client. But you can also generate a WebSocket client. Well, that's a broken model that we found. That's also a broken model in OpenAPI that many people are complaining because there are many fields in the definition that are either meant for one or the other. So for instance, if you have a description or a summary or an operation ID, and this applies both to AsyncAPI and OpenAPI, you're probably writing it like this endpoint accepts a request from the client, blah, blah, blah. That's the server's perspective, right? It's talking about what the server is doing. If the operation ID is saying on post user, imagine that the ID of the operation is called on post users. You would expect that this is the server code that is handling a post request to the user's endpoint, right? Let's say if you want to do the same thing from the client and generate the client from the same AsyncAPI document or OpenAPI document, it works for both. You will get a code generated that says on post users. And that is not on, that is actually sending the post request, right? So there are many things in the spec. There are multiple things, not many, but a bunch of them in the specs that tie them together to a client or a server, right? To one of the perspectives. So what we are suggesting now with V3 is that if you're going to have an AsyncAPI document for your, let's say, server, I'm quoting here with my hands, even though you cannot see it. So if you're going to have an AsyncAPI document for your AsyncAPI document for your server, that doesn't mean that you can reuse it for the client. So we tell people to create another one for the client. And the reason is that, like I said, like just because I'm subscribing or publishing to a topic, that doesn't mean that you will be able to do the reverse operation on that topic, right? That's common. We commonly found that this is not possible. And it's also that just because I'm, let's say, sending a message to 3 different brokers, that doesn't mean that you should have access to these 3 different brokers, right? I might just want you to access one of them. So you anyway need a subset of my document, not the whole document.
So you're saying you have 2 separate files, the server file and the client file, but I know you said server and client is confusing, but the producer side, you're still the one creating both of those documents.
Ideally, yes. That's usually the case if you're going to publish it for public usage, for public consumption, then you should probably craft the ideal client experience there and interactions that they can do. But if it's something internal, you might just want to have one single file, right? One single AsyncAPI file, and then let the rest of the teams to figure out how to actually communicate with you, right? We also see it often, right? Like it's internal, we know how to do it. Where you're publishing, I can actually subscribe, so that's not a problem. That is usually not an issue, right? But yeah, what I'm saying is that you should be crafting these 2 files if possible, and we'll be offering tools for that. In case your main AsyncAPI file can be just simply translated to, let's say, the client version or the outsider version, if you want, right? Like directly reversing the verbs, send and receive, then we're going to offer a tool for you to quickly change the verbs. And so you don't have to worry about the rest. And yeah, so it will be something quickly. But yeah, the spec now defines that it will be what a specific application is doing.
Okay. So just to extrapolate this out, and this is the naive person saying, but let's just say we have 2 systems that are talking to each other and they're sending messages back and forth. System A is going to have a send and a receive set of documents. And if I create both of those, then the other service uses the flip side. But don't they also have to create their own 2 copies? Like, don't we end up with 4 copies of async API documents? Or have I gone like off the rails and that doesn't make any sense?
What I mean, so you can have all of them in a single AsyncAPI file, right? So I'm not saying that you should be creating one for send, another one for receive, but it's just you create an AsyncAPI document for your application, right? Whatever that means. Let's say you have client A, right, or system A, sending messages, but also receiving messages in different channels. I'm going to create a single AsyncAPI file where I put all this information. My application is sending and receiving here and here and here, right? On system B, I'll probably be doing the flip side, as you said, of system A, or the flip side of some of them, not all of them, right? Because I might not be interested in all the things that you're doing on system A. And I may also be doing some other operations on system B, completely different from system A, right? That are completely different, right? So it will be the flip side. If it's all internal, most likely where system A is sending, system B will be able to receive directly. So that's why we're going to offer that tool, right? So that you can quickly switch the verb if you want. But if system B is, let's say, a public client or a partner client, then you probably want to offer them that system B AsyncAPI file, right? Or at least the operations that they should have in their system B AsyncAPI file, right? So you might want to craft that because, like I said, maybe they cannot receive the messages directly in the same channel as where they were published initially, right, by system A. So we learned over the last 2 years that in client server, it's a one-to-one relationship. So it's always the client and the server. There's no one else. There might be some actors in the middle, but they act transparently as the server. But in event-driven architectures, what we learn is that this is not the same. This is a many-to-many relationship, right? This is actually a mesh of multiple nodes talking to each other, right? Usually through a broker, right? So we definitely had to adopt a different perspective when it comes to how to define these communication patterns.
Like you said, it's clearly a breaking change through version 3.
Yes.
Was that the only thing, or did you take the time to add other new features that were maybe not related to that or possibly related to that, but other benefits?
So one thing that we learned the hard way was we thought like now that we're going to break AsyncAPI, we're going to produce a version 3, we cannot just ship it with that breaking change because then people will be like, I don't care. This is just your problem. It's fixing a problem of yours. I'm still fine with version 2, so I don't care. I'm not going to migrate. But because we want to encourage people to keep migrating and growing with us, with the feature of the spec and the direction the spec is taken, we thought like, okay, so we're going to add some more features, valuable features for the users, something that they will actually like to use, love to use, right? So we are introducing request reply support on AsyncAPI. And to me, that is an amazing addition because unlike OpenAPI that has, like request response, let's say over HTTP, we also have it on HTTP, but you can do different request reply, what do you call that, patterns over brokers as well. For instance, I can give you an example. Over brokers, let's say, request reply often works that you publish a message on a specific topic, and then you might receive the reply on a different topic, right? Or that you publish a message on a given topic, and on the same time, you don't know where you're going to receive the reply, but the message that you're publishing to a given topic will contain information, metadata saying, I want you to reply to this other topic, right? So this new topic will have to be probably generated on the fly on runtime. And then the client or the consumer will have to subscribe to that other topic, right? To receive the reply, which is, let's say, it's often the same. So the client is the same. It's the same kind of request reply pattern that you see over HTTP. It's just that in some cases, in many cases, in event-driven architectures, it's not over HTTP. It's over some other protocols like AMQP, like MQTT or Kafka. And then you don't have responses as such. So you have to model them differently. And all these cases have been considered for version 3. And you can define this kind of interactions now with version 3.
Yeah, that seems like something that, like you said, came from OpenAPI, and that wasn't a model that existed. And it wasn't simple request response works, it's request and reply. And so that's a different pattern specific to event-driven architectures. And I think that's what makes AsyncAPI so powerful is it started from OpenAPI, but it was focused on the EDA approach. And now you're trying to bring in more and more of those patterns of here's how you do a good event-driven architecture, and here's the patterns we see. And now AsyncAPI is capturing more of those patterns as something you can just document, as opposed to we only had this small set of verbs and nouns we could use to describe what we wanted to do. And now request reply is a first-class citizen. Is that accurately describe what's going on?
Correct. Yeah, exactly. I will just add that in AsyncAPI, we didn't want to define, let's say, the EDA landscape It was more like protocol agnostic. So we were just focused on defining the interactions, whether they were over HTTP or any other protocol. So that's why it's still possible to document your REST API using V3. You can do it. We don't yet, let's say, suggest it or recommend it because we're not yet there when we compare to OpenAPI when it comes to HTTP specific features. But we're getting there. We're actually getting to a point where you will be able to document everything. I mean, REST APIs and event-driven architectures with AsyncAPI.
So I think we grossly categorize our users as two groups: the people who are using Async API now and are probably on version 2, and people who haven't yet used it. If you're on version 2, what is the impetus? Why should they upgrade to version 3? And what are the steps and what effort does it take for them to get there?
So reasons to migrate to version 3, if you're in version 2, I will say don't do it unless you need it, right? So just let's be pragmatic here. So if you think you're going to need request reply, for instance, go ahead and migrate it. If maintaining V2 is becoming a hell for you because of publish and subscribe, because you cannot reuse the channel definitions, because it's not possible to reuse channel definitions in V2, but it is in V3. So if all these things are becoming a pain for you, then migrate to V3. If you're just fine with V2, then continue using V2. We're going to keep supporting it for years. So that's not going to be a problem. And the best way to start, I would say, is through our tools. So just go to asyncapi.com and you'll find that Studio and many other tools like the AsyncAPI CLI. You have a bunch of tools that will let you convert your V2 documents to V3 quickly, right? And you can even pass a bunch of them at the same time, and they will be all converted together.
You mentioned maintainability. So what are some of the things that people struggle with in maintaining their async API files? If I recall, they're just YAML or maybe it's JSON, just like OpenAPI, but a lot of times people don't like editing those by hand. Are there things that are easier to do with V3, or is it just different tools? You mentioned Studio and CLIs and other stuff.
So that's the same. That remains the same as YAML and JSON. That's the spec. That's, let's say, the machine readable format. I also hate to edit AsyncAPI files and OpenAPI files by hand. That sucks. And the learning curve is really big. So what we're going to be focusing on 2024, at least on my team at Postman, right? One of the things they're going to be focusing on is on making that experience a little bit better, right? So not so much about automating everything. Actually, even though with AI, we could probably automate a bunch of stuff. But the thing is that nobody likes to edit AsyncAPI files by hand. So some things we're going to be providing on the CLI, on Studio, and other tools are going in that direction of giving you the tools so you don't have to edit AsyncAPI files by hand. So you can edit them using your mouse and clicking here and there and abstractions and even AI, as I said, that's something that we were exploring, but we have to continue this kind of direction. So yeah, but that's for 2024.
Always good to have something else on the roadmap. How long have you been working on version 3? You mentioned 2 years.
2 years.
You were already working on this the last time we had you on the show.
Yes, we were already working on it. Yeah. Even started a podcast series myself because of that, right? So I started interviewing different people so they could give me their perspective and their use cases and so on. And it resulted in a podcast series, actually. So yeah, that was funny.
So you've talked a little bit about some of the tools, and I know that's really the benefit, especially on, I know, OpenAPI, I keep going back to that. The tooling is what makes it so useful and so powerful. And version 2 has a lot of the tools for Async API established. Are those tools going to have to be upgraded to support version 3? And when do you expect that to take place? Are people already working on updating the tools?
It's already there. So we got Studio, we got the AsyncAPI parser, we got generator, Glee, CLI, Modelina. We have a bunch of tools that let you do different things with AsyncAPI, and they're all already migrated. Even at the time we're talking right now, it's already migrated. We made sure that everything is working before we release V3, right?
That's good to know.
So yeah, because that's another thing. So we postponed the release of version 3 for almost 6 months because of this, because we wanted to give a really good user experience to those who are trying it, right? And yeah, we can release version 3, but if it's not usable, who cares?
Right. You need to be able to use it. So we've talked about the people who have to migrate from version 2 and whether they should or not. What about someone who hasn't used this at all? Should they start with version 3? Is there a reason to start with version 2? Is it more their needs, or what should the newbies do?
No, go straight to version 3 if you don't want to suffer the same pains we did. Yeah, definitely start with version 3 because actually it's the latest one. Let's say it's stable, it's going to be well maintained, like V2, of course. But V2 is not going to be developed anymore. It's going to be supported, but we're not going to make changes to V2 anymore, right? So everything that's new is going to be on version 3, 3.1, 3.2, right? Even 4, depending on the kind of change, right? So if you're starting new, starting fresh, start with version 3 because also, the vendors that are supporting AsyncAPI are already migrating their products to support version 3 as well. So you're not going to encounter any kind of block because of using version 3.
And then if someone wants to get started, what is the basic hello world for Async API?
The best way to get a simple case working will be go to the asyncapi.com website and to the docs, and you'll find them there. You have a getting started guide there and with a simple hello world example. It's a little bit long to read here, I would say. It's just the AsyncAPI field, the info object with the title and version, and that's it, actually. You don't need anything else. We made channels optional and operations is optional, so everything else is optional. The minimal document will be just the AsyncAPI field and an info field. That's it, with title and version. But yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
As you said, the documentation is like the low-hanging fruit. Is that the best hello world? Is just use it to document my API. Don't use it to auto-generate anything yet. Just start with the documentation so you learn what it's there for.
So actually, I would suggest that you go to studio.asyncapi.com and try there. So start there with the examples that you see in the documentation. And on the right side of Studio, you will immediately see the documentation generated. That's why I was saying it's a low-hanging fruit because it's immediate, right? As you type, you get it. And it's easy to see. You can download this documentation. You can generate it as HTML, Markdown, or whatever you want to do. Even use our React component to embed it in your website. I mean, React component and web component as well. So yeah, that is something that is really easy to get started. But if you're more in the code side and you don't care so much about documentation, I would suggest that you give Glee an opportunity there. So we have a framework called Glee. For those who don't know what Glee means, it's like happiness, right? So we gave it this name because that's what we wanted developers to feel while using the framework. So it's like, oh, that is really easy to get started. So if you're creating a WebSocket API or an MQTT client or a Kafka client or something like that, give it a go, give it a spin because it's really easy to get started. And the cool thing is that Glee will make sure that you only have to worry about your business logic. You don't have to worry how to connect to Kafka or how to validate the messages and so on. Like, no, that's all handled by Glee. And you only have to write your business logic on the functions that you'll find there. It's really easy to get started. And if you're not a JavaScript guy, you have TypeScript as well. So,
so that covers V3. What's on the roadmap? Is there going to be a V4? Is that, down the road a long ways and you think V3's answered a lot of the needs for now?
There's going to be a V4 for sure. We don't know yet what's going to contain, but something we learned during the last 2 years is that we should not accumulate changes. Just because it's a major version, that doesn't mean that we have to accumulate changes like crazy there. So most likely, there's going to be something in the upcoming year or 2 years, but I'm sure that in 2024, most likely something will pop up that will make us break the spec again and release V4. Hopefully, we always try to do it for the good. And we are starting to talk about like adopting a more like fluent way of releasing new major versions so that we don't accumulate changes in first place. And the fact that we release version 4 doesn't mean that you have to adopt version 4 immediately, right? So we'll make it case by case. So if we think it makes sense, go ahead and adopt it. If it doesn't, then we're not even going to suggest it, right? And there's something, Thomas, if you don't mind, there's something I wanted to add. We are also releasing a new version of our parser. So that's the tool that helps, validate the documents and convert them to a structure, in this case in TypeScript and JavaScript. And we're releasing a new parser with what we call an intent-driven API. So I won't stand because that's for another episode. But I will say to the audience that to have a look at it, because if you're building tools for AsyncAPI or a product at any company, and it happens that you have to use the parser, adopt the new parser because it's made in a way, so the API is made in a way that it's going to save you from future breaking changes as much as possible, right? So the API of the parser is not anymore mapping one by one the structure of the spec like it was before. So now if the structure changes, your code remains the same. You just have to upgrade to the latest version of the parser and it will continue working.
We'll include that and everything else in the show notes, links to everything. So I want to thank Fran Mendez for joining me today on the InfoQ podcast.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Really glad to join you and the InfoQ community. It's a pleasure.
And listeners, we hope you'll join us again for a future episode. See you then.